years of data.
Sorry, I just jumped into life there.
So looking at epidemiological data, police, hospital, emergency department, ambulances, trying to understand what's happening at that very numerical level. We would interview people on the streets, and what we find is, compared to phone surveys, and nobody does phone surveys anymore. I don't know about you guys, I never answer the phone if I don't know the number. We get really high response rates. So we've been out talking to people on streets or in bars, different studies, different methodologies in terms of that part. And you can see that we've done a whole lot of the different cities, and the bit that I talk about there is the Queensland study. We do breath alcohol tests. People love getting breathalyzed in nighttime economy. You want to talk to people? Just say, hey, I'll show you how drunk you are. Literally, we have people lining up and mobbing us to do that. And this photo down in the bottom right-hand corner is of Sydney docks, where we were swamped by people pouring off these party boats. And literally, there was like 10 interviewers, and we were just completely swamped by all these people who wanted to know how drunk they were because they just had complete free access. So we also did community attitude surveys to get a sense of how people were feeling about the alcohol laws and whether they were happy with them or not, and comparing different. We also did observations, and that's a really fascinating thing to do. So go in with what back then were the old tablets, mini tablets, and then iPhones came along and nobody noticed anymore, but we were sitting there with tablets in the first study. And you do a structured observation and you see how crowded the place is. And particularly one of the most interesting findings is if we identify somebody as showing 3 or more signs of intoxication, we'll follow them round and see what happens to them. Do they get supported, taken out, or served again? Some of you might guess that. And then we talk to key informants, and so they are police, lots of venue owners, all of the different people who are players in the nighttime economy. The biggest study by far that we did was to come as the most recent one, and I think I've just mentioned that we're about to do it again in Queensland, so Queensland changed the entire state's regulation from 5 a.m. close to 3 a.m. close in nightlife districts and 2 a.m. close everywhere else. So it was a major change across the whole state. And they also put in place, they were talking about having what they call lockouts. It's a really Australian thing where we think as long as you're not out in the street, you won't cause any harm. We never found evidence to suggest that's the case. But basically they lock you in. It's called locked out. So people are locked out of the venue. You can't get in after say 1 a.m. We call them a lock in. We call them lock in. It's probably a psychological thing up in Australia. What was really interesting was, there's lots of interesting stuff to a nerd like me. But one of the introductions was around mandatory networked ID scanners. So in Geelong, for example, since 2007, there's been a network of scanners on the doors of every venue. It's voluntary. And when we tested it, about 50% of people were getting scanned. But they were scanning people, and particularly it was networked. So there's an accord agreement between all the venues. If you get banned from one venue, you're banned from all venues, and it's for 12 months, right? Nice. You can vary that, but the 12 months is what the venues want. When it comes to government and police, so in Queensland, when the government did it the first time, they made it 10 days. Everybody laughed at them. Like the kids were just like, yeah, I'll see you next week. No worries. I'll use my money for 2 weeks anyway. Whereas we eventually got it changed to a month, but again, the venues were saying we do it for 12 months. What changed was in Queensland now, so a police officer will arrest you for behaving inappropriately. They will upload that immediately, not back at the station. It'll be in the car, be uploaded. Within 10 minutes, you're banned from every venue in the state. Wow. Not only that, the system actually operates in a whole lot of other states too. So if you go next weekend over to Perth, 4,000 kilometres away, you turn up and they go, no, you're an idiot. Go away. It's got some really interesting implications. It's quite powerful, and there's lots of findings that I'm not talking about today, but if you ever want to talk about them, it's hard to shut me up. But there was a number of other things, but they were the main things that happened. And talk about going nuts when we got 2 different sources of funding. And we had, so not only the normal sort of data, but we were able to use the ID scanner data. So we could tell how many people were coming in to and out of the venues at different times, patron interviews, but a whole lot of other things, including school surveys and population surveys. So we used all of these data and we had a lot of fun writing the report. I was deeply upset that when I left for lunch, we'd written a 1,000-page report. When I came back, my colleague had reduced it to 998 pages, and I couldn't convince her to get it back up to 1,000 pages. What happened from that, and it was a government evaluation, was that the measures were retained, which is important because there was major pushback, particularly from the alcohol industry. We made a whole lot of recommendations. 10 of them were rejected. We sort of figured that some of them would be. And we disseminated and got a lot of media and a lot of engagement going forward. And like I said, it's now been repeated. What it allows is this body of research over this time is we can now go, so when we want to compare what happens in Geelong to what happens in Cairns, what are the different sort of levels of blood alcohol level, how drunk are people getting, what does it look like? We start to get some really insights into nighttime economies and the way they work in different places. And you can see one of the clear trends is people drink a lot more and a lot more intoxicated in Queensland. That might be the temperature. There is a temperature effect around violence. It's really a strong one. Same as lead in water. Nobody ever talks about lead in water, but it's a pretty strong effect in terms of temperature. A number of other cities have high ratings and or tend to be fairly similar. Sydney looks really low, but it's actually not. What happened with Sydney was the place where people were doing the most interviews was Darling Harbour, and a lot of them were kind of families going out, and we couldn't get the people who were running that site to change their behaviour. So Sydney was, it says that it's low, but actually the numbers are fairly similar, particularly in terms of violence. And what we saw was, again, using the classic epidemiological technique of squinting and looking at the line and saying, oh, is it going up? So we see that throughout the night, across these different sites, pretty much all of them had a fairly, so on average, linear trajectory. Now, of course, nothing's ever perfect, but there was a fairly consistent increase in levels of intoxication throughout the night. We did try to do work after, so we were out until 6 a.m. or 7 a.m, but it was too messy. It was just not worth doing, and the breathalyzers also stopped because people were too drunk. They would breathe on them in the wrong way and they wouldn't work properly, so we stopped trying. What was interesting was, and we'll talk about the impacts of pre-drinking in Australia, but what happened in Brisbane was we actually found quite a different trend in Brisbane. People, as I said, were more intoxicated at the start of the night and they stayed intoxicated throughout the night. Did you have a question?
No, just.
Yeah. And when we talk about, so this is not police recorded assaults, it's people talking about what they interpret as physical aggression, verbal aggression. And we started asking sexual aggression, but actually we found that was really not a very helpful question, and we needed to turn it around and define the behaviours and call it unwanted sexual attention. But what we found was, again, Queensland had the highest rates, but across the rest of Australia, there was a fairly consistent level of around 15%-ish. Of course, there are ones that are lower, ones that are higher. And physical aggression, verbal aggression was the highest level, and then unwanted sexual attention. The thing that because we asked about sexual aggression, the reason that we were looking at these numbers going 3%, 1%. But when my observation staff went out, every night, our female researchers were being molested, pinched and groped. And I'm like, well, how can that figure match that? It's the beauty of having multiple data sources. You're going, this doesn't match up at all. And it's because when we said sexual aggression, the bar was so low that they thought we were talking about rape. And we weren't talking about rape, we were talking about all the other behaviours. So when we started to say unwanted sexual attention and we mean this, this and this, then we started to get, oh my gosh, 35% rates. What's been interesting in our most recent studies post-COVID, and with a lot of changes in social norms in Australia, is that now men are reporting 30% sexual harassment on the night, women are reporting 50% sexual harassment on the night. That's the discussion we were just starting to have earlier. So we've seen an increase in what's being reported. We think that it's a genuine increase, particularly post-COVID, but also the gender thing is really interesting too. There's some dynamics around that, as always. Sorry, there's a little bit I can't see. The other one is, and of reasonable interest, was we focus on aggression and violence, but actually one of the major harms associated with being intoxicated and out in the nighttime economy in Australia is people falling over drunk, literally falling over drunk and smashing their faces. The hospitals are full of them. And like on one level, I laugh, and we're used to laugh, but actually it's a really serious thing. We did this other study looking in emergency departments and asking people when they'd been, how much they'd been drinking when they arrived in the emergency department. We found the second biggest group after this group of people in nightlife were 50-year-old men falling over at home, face planting and smashing their faces, often going upstairs. So it is quite a serious health burden, but we don't hear about it anywhere near as much. I mentioned pre-drinking earlier. One of our studies started to identify, the first study started to really identify that venues were saying, well, our business model is really troubling now because we have supermarkets selling alcohol cheaper than we can buy it. And that was a really big turning point for the alcohol industry. People had always pre-drunk, you know, I don't know if you've got Passion Pop or something like that here. When we were at uni in engineering, you could get really cheap and nasty alcohol, but you wouldn't really want to drink it. So there was always a degree to that. But what we found was this big change over time that really seems to have cemented by the time we did the Queensland study, where more than 80% of people were pre-drinking significantly before they went out. So we're talking about more than 5 and often 10 drinks before they went to the nighttime economy, which means that they were blowing, you know, 0.08 is quite a high level. And we also found a dose-response relationship. So the more you drink before you go out, the more likely you were to get into a fight. And some of those like 25 plus drinks, they're on days like St. Patrick's Day and New Year's Eve and things like that. But what we also found was when we talked about energy drinks, and don't you love the tattoo? What we found was a really consistent finding. People who use energy drinks on nights they go out are much more likely to engage in everything that is harmful, and to be victims of everything that is harmful. And it's a really interesting dynamic in nights out. So it's only when you're going out for a big night out, and you often delineate that by having energy drinks so that you're going to last longer into the night, and then you make the same bad decisions, you just make them much more quickly. So that's been a really interesting finding. If you didn't know, Red Bull has a group of researchers around the world who every time somebody like me puts out that finding, they do the same study in Utrecht, which is my hometown, and it's really, really calm and peaceful and nice Dutch people who don't fight when they're on Red Bull. So they then come out with a counter paper and say, no, the methodology must have been flawed. And they're still getting funded by Red Bull to this day to produce all this evidence. So that's why you don't hear about it as a factor. But in some Australian cities, it's still after midnight, you're not allowed to consume Red Bull. They just went, nobody needs Red Bull after midnight except for police officers and bouncers, right? We put all of this together in great big models, which considered all of this. And what we really found was there are multiple things that predict harm. Just being out after midnight means that you're significantly more likely to suffer harm. Pre-drinking means that you're significantly more likely to suffer harm. And the number of 1.13, 1.18, to put that in context, that's 18% more likely or 13% more likely. None of these are game changers on their own. It's about multiple influences on different things. How much you drink, and of course, how long you've been drinking for. The reason midnight matters is it's 4 hours after you sort of start or normally go to sleep, or start to go to sleep for most people. And so there's a really good literature around tiredness and grumpiness, and how when you've been awake for 8 hours more than you would normally be awake for, your cognitive decline without alcohol is the same as being at 0.05 level of alcohol. So you've kind of got a double whammy when you're out there drinking and been awake for a long time. And interestingly, in Australia, smoking cannabis is protective. You're less likely to get into trouble if you've been smoking cannabis on your night out. But that's not a case for legalisation. I don't know if you've looked at the American situation and all the legalisation there. Within a week, the alcohol industry had cannabis-infused vodka, cannabis-infused bourbon, and nobody knows what that does. No, like mixing. So fascinating to see. I'm not going to go through all these details. What I wanted to sort of talk about was we conceptualize it in sort of 3 different ways these days. The issue of problem substance, which I've just sort of pointed to a little bit, the notion of problem venues and problem people. I'm going to spend most time talking about problem people because that's how I get to shame. But just a few things about what works to reduce the harm, just so you can show the sort of things we do. In Australia, I don't know what you guys do here. So most of our Liquor Acts have all these statements about responsible service of alcohol. And that's the notion because by definition, once you're intoxicated, you can no longer make rational decisions. So it's got to be the people who are serving you with alcohol who are responsible for your well-being. And we have absolutely no doubt that if you've got nothing in place, training helps. Now, there's a great set of studies out of Sweden where they had nothing in place. And they did the study beforehand where the researchers went to the bars, they spilt the drink, dumped their change, fell asleep on the bar. And then they got woken up to be served more drinks before the training. And then afterwards, after the training, they didn't do that. But that was their bar of what's responsible service and what's not responsible service, right? So sometimes it all depends on your measurement. When we did in Australia, as I mentioned before, we followed people in the bars who were showing obvious signs of intoxication. So for us, that's quite important to be able to say to policymakers, this is working or this is not working. And what we found over almost all the studies, it was between 80 and like 86% in all the different studies. 8 out of 10 people who were heavily intoxicated were still getting served more alcohol and were not receiving the support that you would expect, whether that be just simple things like staff approaching them and saying, are you okay, or anything like that. So it was really a welcome to the jungle sort of scenario, that people were being left completely off and to be continued to be served. So that context puts it in, is an important one within, okay, so what other measures can you put in place? Because everybody says, well, we've got responsible service of alcohol. Well, yeah, but does that actually mean it works? And then there's a question in my home state of Victoria, which has this hilarious definition. So nobody's been done for serving a drunk person in a venue in 8 years, despite 13,000 people being fined for being drunk on premise. So police can get you for being drunk. They can't get the venue for serving you because there's no difference between, in the legal definition, between being intoxicated and being drunk. They don't say you got to have 4 symptoms versus 5 symptoms or anything like that. So it gets really funny. And this matters when you're talking about people trying to enforce these sort of situations. Am I going for time? Yeah. Okay. I'll jump that one. So we know also closing bars earlier has a significant effect, a very significant effect. So this is Newcastle, where they closed the pubs. They went from 5 a.m. trading to 3 a.m. trading. Over the whole course of that graph, we actually got a 57% reduction in police recorded assaults. It's over the course of 4 years. When we looked at it in Sydney, where there was a lot of controversy, you can see again a really substantial change in terms of reductions in violence. The little green line down the bottom is people said, oh, everything went to somewhere else. And to a degree over time, again, this study was for like 2 years, but in 3 years, there were venues popping up on the outside. And so that matters to a degree, but then also on the other hand, it really changed the nightlife and the level of violence there. So a massive reduction in Sydney. It was around 57%. And then in Queensland, we saw more nuanced results because of the way it was implemented. So they didn't actually shut the bars because the gambling industry have pokies inside all of the pubs. So what they really want is drunk people to be gambling at 4 a.m. So they stopped service of alcohol at 3 a.m. But then the people who had nowhere to go to would stay there and gamble and then get onto the street. So we saw reductions, but it wasn't quite as great as other places that actually shut and pushed them out. I think I took out, and so that's for brain injury. And this is to show that actually what we've demonstrated in most of these cities, and this is other authors' work, we've got similar sort of data, is it didn't reduce the number of people going out. In fact, most people go out until about 2:30 a.m. in most cities around Australia. Don't know what it's like here, but the vast majority of people have left and gone home by 3 a.m. There's still a group of people. The question is whether the venues actually make money. And we have lots of transcripts that say they don't really. The 24-hour transport thing was interesting. In Victoria, so the local head of the Hotels Association has a swipe card to the Premier's office. That tells you about our election funding and what happens. It's very powerful. They were able to convince the government to put in place 24-hour public transport on weekends to reduce violence at a cost of $100 million a year to the public. And what you can see from here is nothing changed at all. There was no reduction, but there was no more people. Like you sort of go, free public transport, maybe more people will go out. Nope. People who go out, go out. People who don't go out, don't go out. Nobody went more. Nobody really went longer, as you can see in these graphs. And levels of assault, they dropped for a little while because actually it started to spike and the police had to come in and push things down for a bit, but then it came back up to the same sort of level. So we saw a bit of an increase and then a leveling out. So it didn't really work. And one of the interesting ones was when you've got the data that we had in Queensland, what we actually found was, so assaults were occurring more after 1 a.m. Foot traffic was peaking. This is people coming into venues, peaked at about midnight. So the assaults were occurring in the venues, not out on the streets, but they were spilling out onto the streets later. That's where the police were recording them later on. So there was this idea that all the assaults happened on the street because that's where the public can see them. But actually, they were mostly occurring in the venues. So getting on to the bit that I should be talking about, which is problem people. So when we talk about who's responsible for violence in nighttime economies, there's a lot of data out there, a lot of studies that show that there's a very small group of people who commit a lot of crime. This shouldn't be a surprise to most of you. Most of the responses that are actually supported by government industry tend to be on that small group of offenders. And that's really interesting because then we started to say, so what do these people look like? So we did a whole lot of other studies. In addition to the studies we were doing out in the nighttime economy, we started to do a whole lot of survey work about, so who gets violent? When do they get violent in the nighttime economy? And we did a whole lot of different ways. We started off talking to just uni students because that's what you do. They're free and they're easy to get to. But actually, we were doing one of these nightlife studies and we were doing one of these university student studies at the same time. And the people I would talk to on a Saturday night on the street looked nothing like the people who were getting the rewards for doing our surveys. And I went, right, we've got to stop doing that. So we actually found the ideal group in Australia to talk to is tradespeople. They engage, 35% of them engage in weekly violence in nighttime economies. These are builders, plumbers, concreters especially because they're really strong. So we did all these studies and trying to figure out, we started with looking at masculinity. Oh, sorry, I've gone off the topic. I'll come back to it. What we did find was alcohol generally influences violence in terms of reducing cognitive ability, creates disinhibition. You focus on the moment. You don't really think about consequences. You get quite obsessed and you've got poor decision-making skills and interpretation of social cues. So you're not interpreting the cues. It's your emotions interpreting the cues, not your cognition anymore. And we know that people who are more likely to experience alcohol harm have greater trait aggression, sensation seeking, and lower emotional control. We thought originally, this is 2009, we started doing this. We were very interested in the whole construct of masculinity and the notion of toxic masculinity. So we started doing those studies like everybody else. And when we just asked about masculinity, it was really strongly significant. But then being psychologists, we said, well, who aligns with notions of masculinity? And it turns out it's some really interesting people who align with those notions of masculinity. And it wasn't until 2010, I had an Aboriginal student who said, hey, we've really got to look at what happens between mums and dads and the kids, because in our community, in the Aboriginal community, you see the violence transferred and you see that behaviour then play out. So then we asked, so tell us about how you were treated as a child. And because we were talking about boys, so this study was focused on our men, and we looked at, did your father hit you? And the number was astounding. This is 4.5 times more likely to get into a fight as an 18 to 20-year-old than somebody who wasn't hit by their parent, by their dad. And it blew away everything else. Any notion of masculinity became non-significant. It no longer mattered. The thing that predicted it was, were you hit as a child? Did you grow up in an environment where you experienced violence as being a solution to your problems? Now that started us down a whole other track. So then we went, oh, we'll look at corporal punishment, because I don't know, my brain's just get focused on one thing at a time. So we started to do all these different things around how does masculinity then link with that, and where are the major findings? So we found again and again and again, corporal punishment mattered, but it wasn't as stronger as predictor as quite a few of the studies. And then somebody mentioned to me, well, you're only looking at one of the adverse childhood experiences. And I said, what are adverse childhood experiences? So very quickly, because I realised I'm going way over time.
Okay, wrap it up.
Adverse childhood experiences, things like physical, sexual, emotional abuse, and growing up in a house where parents have been put in prison or have drug and alcohol problems or mental health problems. The impact is huge. It's in huge impacts on social behaviour, on physical health, things like cancer, diabetes, heart disease. Absolutely massive. And so we started to go, okay, so what, and when we talk about criminal behaviour, in Australia, 89% of young people in jail for domestic violence have histories of maltreatment and household dysfunction. So we're not talking about a minority. We're actually talking about the majority of kids in prison. And if you're a kid in prison, you'll be very lucky not to be an adult in prison. In Australia, I'm not talking about you guys. I think you've got some better systems, but it's a major predicament. So then I happened to read, I'm just sticking to what I know. I'd only ever met Luna being that big before yesterday. I then got influenced first by the work. I read James Gilligan, and someone said, you've got to read Luna's work. And we started to look at trauma and then shame, and shame in particular as being the emotion of trauma. Most of us can relate to shame and the power of shame. I'm going to jump this slide, sorry. But it does say down the bottom how wonderful Luna's work is. And really thinking about shame, and particularly the compass of shame, and the way in which shame is such a powerful motivator and so incredibly relevant when you're talking about people responding to perceived aggression, not actual aggression, right? Perceived aggression. Again, you go back to being drunk. Well, depends on your personality makeup, your history of trauma. I pretty much perceive everything as aggression. So, and you add alcohol to that, and you tend to attack yourself, some of us, others attack others, and then you can also withdraw or compensate, says the workaholic. So to wrap up, and I am wrapping up, I promise. I now, when I start to talk about this, realise that the study I was doing in around addiction and people overdosing and having ambivalence toward death was very much a story about trauma and shame, and those people experiencing deep levels of shame. I have never personally met, and I met a lot of them, I've never met a heroin user who didn't have a history of sexual abuse. the numbers are closer to 80%, but we're talking about deep ingrained level, both trauma and shame. And I wanted to finish talking that where we're now headed is we've actually started to think about relationships, because the breaking of trauma and the power of shame comes from the potential busting of relationships. I won't go into this too deep, but we've been doing a lot of work around how can we use education, relationship education, not counselling, because counselling, you're just digging up the past and nobody's relationships will survive that. But giving people skills about how to have relationships, not just intimate relationships, but workplace relationships and schoolyard relationships. We're finding that really promising. So it was a really long journey to end up studying the same sort of topics, but the new discoveries have really made it important to reconsider a lot of the insights we have. And I think studying and, more importantly, talking about trauma, shame, neurodiversity and relationships will really improve our communities. And that is me.
Brilliant.
Way
No, it's right. We started a bit late. I do recognize
that's
technical. So we'll open it up for questions, and we can take questions from the Zoom call. And you're welcome to raise your hand, and you can speak your question, or you can just type it in the chat. And then we've also got people in the room. If anyone in the room has a question.
The first question in the chat actually was, would it be possible to get a copy of the slides?
Yep.
Thank you. You can circulate those, yeah.
Yep.
Do you guys have any questions? Well, we're waiting. I think what the bit, like, just as you get just to that whole bit at the end around sort of the trauma and shame bit is kind of where it gets, I think, really interesting for us, doesn't it? Because I think we're dealing with a very sort of small community of people in Exeter who, are suffering from sort of drug and alcohol addiction, which we understand to be caused by kind of childhood trauma, but we don't really understand necessarily kind of how to resolve that. I think, when we're talking about the impact that has on the city, business, the city, on businesses, on the whole thing, like is, we're trying to sort of, we've got a very narrow set of tools, I think, that we can deal with it. And we're kind of really looking at what the wider mechanisms are for trying to deal with the causes of that ASB. But yes.
Well, I'm here to learn about. A lot of my visits have been around trauma-informed policing, neuro-aware policing out of Thames Valley, and the trauma-informed policing out of Lancashire, and learn what's been done and what's not been done. The nightlife scenario is quite interesting, and also city centres. We had a conference earlier in the year on trauma-informed policing and law enforcement, so more broadly corrections, because you've got a bit more space. I think the question is, within your limited engagement period and the focus that you need to manage those situations, how can you do that and still be informed? And I think the trauma-informed sort of practices, I don't know how much you guys have done, so you probably know much more about it than me, but some of the trauma-informed and shame-competent practices can still allow you to engage, to control the situation to a point of safety, but in the first point, for officers and other workers not to get escalated, so that you're walking up and you're going, okay, do I assume one of two things? Either this person has a history of trauma or they don't. My assumption is we've all got histories of trauma, pretty much. So if you walk in with that assumption, then you go, whatever they're about to do, the way they're reacting to me, they're yelling and screaming, it's not about me. And they're probably in an emotional threat response state, because you don't act out unless you're feeling an emotional threat response. And again, it's about perception. I perceive that bloke's doing that to me, or I perceive my girlfriend's about to leave me. And that is actually the worst thing that can happen to a young bloke, for example. So in that threat response state, they're not acting rationally. So if you go in there and say, calm down, nobody has ever calmed down when told to calm down. So stepping back and going, what's going on for you, mate? Yeah. Something like that. So I don't know how much you get. I mean, I'm sure you get de-escalation training.
Yeah, and we're pretty trauma informed now.
Yeah.
Compared to when I first joined. I suppose for us, the interesting bit is the police are relatively well trauma informed as a responder, but it's that space before that. We know in Exeter there's probably I sort of bound around a number of about 30 people
Mhm.
who are our 1%, causing 60 whatever percent of our crime. And it's about that space and what can we influence as a city to work with, you know, deconstructing shame in that space. Because if we can get that right, it doesn't really matter how well informed police are, we're not going to be needed. So, you know, all our effort goes into the kind of, you know, on that journey, all the effort and all the pressure we get politically is around our crime figures and what we're doing about it. And, you know, the traders say, why is there so much antisocial behavior, etc. And we're like, well, because we're the wrong people to talk to. We're actually quite good at arresting people. It's kind of what we do every day. What we really want to do is put all our effort into how do we deal with addiction? Why are they already addicted? And that's where the effort needs to be. So I think that shame bit, I like probably understanding a bit more around how you would go about deconstructing, influence the shame.
Thankfully, I don't even know to answer the question because there's as you saw at the start, I mentioned that we have started Trauma Aware Geelong, and I'm copying Trauma Informed Lancashire and Trauma Informed Plymouth, and that notion exactly being driven by police in many cities going, well, hang on, we can be trauma informed, but there's no point in us being trauma informed if the traders are kicking them off because they're yelling at them for doing the same thing they've been doing for 20 years. And
so a trauma informed city would be amazing.
Just thinking how we might bake that into like the safety charter for the city. There's something about that being
That's kind of the model in Plymouth.
And so there's Lancashire and Thames Valley are also there. So the violence reduction units have been driving that, and you guys don't have one, do you? A violence reduction unit.
Well, we're Devon and Cornwall, so we actually do share with Plymouth.
Oh, you do?
Yeah,
Oh no,
well,
do you have a violence reduction unit?
I don't know.
I don't think you.
Not like we
I don't think you've got the same levels of Burnley. So for example, now somebody from Burnley is going to be really angry at me.
I'll just say there's some questions in the chat.
Do you want to start with the top one?
Yeah, so there was a question from Anna. She said, how have you bridged psychology and sociology in this work? Do you separate them?
Okay. I mean, so I don't really exactly separate them. I think I'm probably a bad sociologist and a troublesome psychologist. I certainly, so what I did do was quite a while ago, I stopped engaging in sociological theory. I didn't find it helpful. That's controversial, but I consider myself a bit more of a pracademic than an academic. I'm more interested in making real social change than engaging in a social theory argument. So I left most of the engagement around sociology. I still get it. I still appreciate most of that original learning, but I'm much more, and I'm not even necessarily really psychology these days.
Liz asked just a curiosity question, but have you linked up this work with the addiction recovery work that people like Professor David Best has been leading on at all? I see a lot of parallels with the work he's led on and real commonalities clearly around trauma and shame.
So Bestie and I used to, we used to be together at the Maudsley at the National Addiction Centre, and we used to debate what recovery was over beers on a Friday night. And they were some of the best, most honest conversations I've ever had.
Yeah.
He's an amazing guy, and we firmly agree on everything we firmly agree on. And I think we've both probably forgotten what we disagree about these days. But I think so my space has now gone to the trauma space, and I just literally haven't seen David in 10 or 15 years. But so much of what he's talking about, and back then we used to talk about, well, is recovery stopping? And the answer is, of course not. So what does recovery really look like? And how do you define a functional human being when they have these histories of trauma? But we didn't have the language or understanding of trauma back then.
Yeah, I think that probably does.
I hope that answered the question. But...
Yes, well, Liz, if you'd like to add anything else, please do.
Yeah.
Olivia asked, how do we intervene in generational cycles of abuse and trauma, particularly from father to son? Education in schools, increasing access and decreasing stigma to trauma therapy. Can we intervene? That's
Yes.
a question.
Yeah, so there's actually a lot of work in this space. And we've been talking a little bit about, there's a lot of work in the United States, a lady called Nadine Burke Harris, who Just Google her, and she does TEDx talks, and she was a pediatrician in California in one of those really deprived suburbs who learned about adverse childhood experiences and started to act, became the Surgeon General for California and has been putting in huge programs. And they're just some examples. I think having the conversation around trauma and shame on an ongoing basis, and every time you look at somebody, go, are you feeling ashamed? Am I feeling ashamed? Why are we in this position? What's going on here? Or is it a threat response, not the shame response, but a threat response? What am I feeling that's, particularly if you're starting to feel angry? But when you get a colleague that doesn't answer your email or something like that, I mean, there's a lot of people in our world that do that. And I think most of us go on an automatic assumption of their behaviour based on our life experience, not so much on theirs. So I think that there is a huge number of interventions, and getting the right treatment systems in place. It's funny, a lot of psychologists are worried that when we start talking about trauma, oh no, we can't already deal with what we've got. But there's a really strong literature that says, actually, most people with trauma don't disclose until 27 years on average after the event, and they don't need you to fix them. Just shut up and listen. And at the end, stop trying to fix people, listen to what they're saying, because most people have never had their stories. The clinicians are ticking off boxes. They're not listening to people's stories. And you need to actually vocalize stuff. If you're going through a rough time, you need to talk about it, because your brain goes through a different process when you talk. And that's how we sort things out, not by thinking about shit, by talking about it. So just by being able to do that, and then finding, yes, some people will be ready for treatment, and treatment works. Treatment's great.
Thank you. Anna asked another question. Doesn't dealing with addiction need to be acknowledging the roots, like adverse childhood experiences, which means supporting parenting and relationships? That might go to the conversation we were having about a trauma-informed city. So,
absolutely. Intergenerational is all about acknowledging trauma. Means acknowledging that many of us are going to be mostly who we are for the rest of our lives. And that it's not saying we only focus on the kids, but we can do it very differently. And the discussions around trauma and shame in particular, shaming kids, guaranteed to get bad results. So those conversations, without shaming the parents for being just human, and all of us are on autopilot. We still don't teach kids how to parent in school. So those things are really, really important, along with all of the other bits too.
that's really interesting. Sorry, my aunt is a health visitor in London. She works with parents who have had traumatic relationships themselves, and she runs a parenting course that lasts about 10 or 12 weeks for these parents. And she says she talks them through this process, and she said there's a point at about week 6 where they go, maybe it's my response that's affecting my relationship with my child.
Yep.
She said it happens every time without fail. They get to about week 6 and they go, I could fix this if I change, like I could respond differently. And she's like, she just facilitates it, but it is something that just by letting people tell their stories and experiencing it, it seems to play out in every time, she said.
My understanding of the literature and common knowledge is the best thing you can do for your kids in terms of parenting is to do some understanding of what you're carrying from your parents, because most of it's automatic. We parent automatically. I don't know how many of you have had kids and how many of you have gone, why is my father speaking through my bloody mouth?
I don't have kids.
Particularly when you're
tired out my voice.
Exactly.
Like,
I'm just going to say it's 2:00 right
Sorry.
now. We can
Yeah.
carry on doing questions if people can stay, but if anyone needs to leave, please feel free. I know Alice, you've got another meeting.
Yeah.
So
Thanks, Alice.
yes, I think Maria, the captioner, might need to take a break or pause.
I think we could stop the captioning.
We can stop. Yeah. So thank you, Maria. You.
I'm okay. I can continue on for a little while longer. I'm good. Thanks.
Oh, lovely. Thank you.
Thanks,
Thank you
Maria.
very much. Yes, there was another question. How did you go about approaching the tradespeople in the bars? Or
Not even the bar. No, so
No.
actually we found them at work sites, because we've got heaps of building in around our city, and it was very easy to turn up So, 97% of psychology students are female. It was very easy to turn up at these work sites and say, can we talk to you over lunch? And we had a couple of males and a couple of females, but it was very easy to get them during lunch because they were actually just sitting there bored most of the time eating their lunch. So that's when we interviewed them out on the trade sites.
Olivia has another question. How is this escalated by structural racism in policing? And her previous question was around generational cycles of abuse. So I don't know if that also relates to that, or if it's the alcohol and violence.
So I don't know the evidence about the impact of structural
Racism
in policing. I do know that most people in the field now consider being of skin other than white is clearly an adverse childhood experience in the vast majority of the world. It's one of many, but it's a very substantial predictor of traumatic experience, of just having those traumatic experiences. So whether the policing element of that was going to be an added one, you would presume so. And most police forces I know are desperately trying to address it. Certainly in Australia, they're desperately trying to address that. But they're facing some really substantial, particularly where they're dealing with really complex populations as well. But I would say it's certainly an issue, but it's probably police usually reflect community attitudes too. So it's not like you guys live outside the rest of the community. You come from the community, you live in the community. So
Olivia, if you're Exeter based, I'd love to host you and we could take you into the city centre and just see, it'd be really interesting to just feel that challenge really around, to display what we do and see if we could do it better.
Yeah, and I think the whole thing about the trauma and adverse childhood experiences is which one it is doesn't matter as much as how many, and the lack of a positive person. So one of the weird things about all this negative story is actually having one person in your life that can be a stronger, wiser other can make all of the difference in terms of being able to turn the corner. And it's usually, particularly when you think, so we call it child protection, I think you call it in care. When you think about those kids in care or in child protection, our system in Australia criminalises them at every step of the way. Every time they act out, it's not their mum or dad they're dealing with. They're dealing with a worker who's part-time and just out of university who's threatened, so they call the police because they're yelling, and then the kid's criminalised for being a ward of the state, and they get these huge criminal rates. And they don't have an individual who loves them. And so,
Yeah. Sorry, that was I had a personal response to that because I had a foster sister who did very similar.
Yep.
It was in a similar situation. Your mention of tradespeople makes me wonder if this is fundamentally a question about inequality. Should we be thinking about how universal basic income could be connected to decreasing the risk of violence?
sounds good. So I think I guess most people who have social training would see the benefits of a universal type income where you were taking that stress out of families and creating safe generations going forward. And it would be an intergenerational impact, not an immediate impact, I suspect, because often we do interventions like that and expect immediate change, but you haven't changed that person's history or trauma or brain. And that takes decades for the most dedicated individuals and lucky individuals, let alone people with lots and lots of challenges. So it would be, unfortunately, I would love to see that, but I don't necessarily think it would have the impacts in the short term in the same way, though I'm still a strong advocate for it.
Yeah. Shall we wrap?
Yeah.
So we can close the Zoom and thank everyone for coming. So I think if anyone has further questions, I think you would be happy to receive emails, Peter, speaking on, so you're very welcome to email Peter. And thank you all for coming.
Thank you.
Yeah,
Thanks
we
very
share
much.
slides.
Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely.
Thank you. Lost my mouse again.
Thanks for hosting.
Yeah.
Which bit do you work at here?
I work in this research centre, but I was saying